Hello. The central goal of resource planning is to ensure that we have the right resources acquired and allocated to our project. To do that, we first need to figure out what are the true resource needs in our project. In theory, we can calculate it from the triangle shown in the picture here. And it also shows how actually resource planning goes hand in hand with scope and schedule planning. So for instance, if scope management tells us that here's a work package, requires 40 hours of work, and scheduling gives us an input of, schedule gives us 1 week time to perform that task, then we obviously would need one resource working 8 hours a day to do the job. However, here's a pitfall. Scope management often bases its estimates on very rough figures and on average capacities of human beings. However, we do know that we are all different, and some of us may be able to do a certain job in 35 hours, whereas for others it might take 45. And this creates a need for iteration among resource planning, scope planning, and schedule planning. So to sum up here, in practice, schedules are always constrained by the amount and quality of resources available for our projects. There's another thing to this as well. Actually, the schedules are also constrained by the amount of resources possible to manage within a project. So, for instance, instead of having one resource on this work package, we could use 5 and kind of think that we could do it in 1 day. However, there may be certain physical limits to this, for instance, space, which is often the case in construction projects. We cannot accommodate more people working on the same task simultaneously. It also creates a coordination problem for the management, because he or she would have to coordinate the communication between 5 resources instead of having one communication line. Thinking further about resource needs, we can distinguish between 5 different types of resources. It's people, like we saw on the previous slide, that is human resources. It's also facilities, such as office space, warehouses, laboratories, or even parking lots. It's equipment, such as testing equipment, or cranes, which is often a constraining factor in construction projects. We also have 2 slightly different types of resources that are needed in projects. Money, that is how we fund our project, is often dealt by project finance in the early stages of projects. We have materials, which is dealt by the procurement function in our project. However, both of these may constrain our schedule execution quite significantly. So for instance, if we have miscalculated the need for funding in our projects and the timing of funding, we might run out of money to pay the salary of our employees. Or certain materials can have a very long lead time and hence be almost decisive of the end date of the project, and must therefore be taken into account when doing scheduling. And that's when we talk about long lead time items. Once we've identified the resource needs in our project, we need to start acquiring those resources. We can acquire resources either internally from our organization or externally. When we acquire internal resources for our project, we need to realize that we actually compete for the same resources as other projects within our organization. This often creates a prioritizing problem for the senior management in the company. Internal resources may also originate from various units within the company. In such situations, we often agree on certain transfer prices in order to cover the costs for those resources. External resources are, just like materials, often handled by the procurement function in our project. Once the right resources are acquired, we need to start loading them into our schedules. So for each work package we have, we need to identify a responsible person and resources in order to accomplish the job. Doing that, we obtain the organizational breakdown structure of our project, which matches the work breakdown structure. Loading resources can essentially be done in three different ways. We can set an even load for a specific resource throughout the whole project. For instance, 20% of the available time of that resource. Or we can set the full resource load for a person, meaning that we use it to 100% of his or her available time in our project. Or we can let the resource load vary over time in the project, such that, for instance, we use the resource a bit less in the beginning, a bit more in the middle, and less again towards the end. The result of resource loading is often shown as a resource histogram, like you can see on the screen. From this diagram, we can see that we need 4 resources of type 2 during the first week in our project. The last step of resource planning is leveling project resources. The purpose of this is to achieve an even distribution of load on the resources, simply because it's often more effective to have a person working with an even load rather than peak loading him or her from time to time. However, this must be done given certain constraints, such as the dependencies between different activities, the availability and capacity of the specific resource, and cost. There are 4 ways to level resources. First of all, we can use float in case the activity is not on a critical path. We can also move the time of finish for that specific task, and this again is applicable to activities not on the critical path. We can divide activities into parts, for instance, such that a person starts with an activity, produces some preliminary input for others, then works a while on another project, just to come back and finish the task. If we are talking about a critical activity, we can use none of the 3 mentioned ways to level resources. And then the only way may be to use a replacement resource. The problem with using a replacement resource is that there is often a learning curve when starting in a project. So that might also come with certain disadvantages. Finally, I'll just use a diagram to illustrate how we can use float to level resources in our projects. On the left here, you see a project schedule which is done according to the early start of floating activities. When we have resource loaded this schedule, we can calculate the accumulated use of resources in our projects. That is the diagram on the right. If instead we use the late start for the floating activities, we are able to postpone the deployment of resources in our project.